Slay is still one of the strongest elements in the series, being able to one-shot regular enemies and dealing percentage-based damage to officers, no matter the difficulty. It will become increasingly useful on higher level missions, where regular enemies can have a good amount of health, especially on missions where you have to kill a certain amount of them. Without Slay, it can get really tedious. Agility increases your attack speed. This element is a staple in the series. The fast attack speed alone is of course a great DPS boost, but this one also allows for more fluent gameplay, since it becomes much easier to combine attacks on medium to slow hitting weapons. Once you have played with it, it becomes very awkward to go back. Bolt and Ice are very strong in this game. They allow you to completely disable most enemies. Bolt stuns them, while Ice freezes them. And in Orochi 4, the enemies stay frozen for a good while. The problem with both elements are the loss of combo opportunities. Frozen enemies stay in place, and lightning will ground them. So attacks that usually send them flying won't, which will disable your air juggling opportunities. Of course, if you don't care about style and only want DPS and receive less hits, then by all means take those elements. By the way, you can socket Dry element in your weapons, which combines Bolt, Ice and Flame into one. And as you can imagine, it's one of the most broken elements you can use. Osmosis gives you Musou and Absorption gives you health on hit. So of course they are great to have. If your character has great Musous or unique magic, Osmosis is a must-have, and on higher difficulties, Absorption is highly recommended on every setup. Wrath and Brilliance, both imbue attacks, which is very vague. What it really means is as long as you have either a full life or Musou gauge, you will trigger elemental attacks on every hit. This includes Ice, Bolt, Flame, Wind and Slay. Wrath is definitely the superior choice here, since it's easier to keep your life gauge full with elements like Absorption. And it also allows your elemental attacks to trigger on Musou and unique magic. If you used Brilliance, it won't trigger, since your Musou gauge isn't full. Merriment and Merciful Blessing, depending if you only want to spam your Musou attacks or you want to get also some health items, you can use either one. The amount of wine dropped by Merriment is actually great, so if you have any officer with an amazing Musou or unique magic, I highly recommend using this element. You could even replace Osmosis with them. Of course you can also run with both for maximum Musou uptime. By the way, Merciful Blessing is an DLC exclusive element from challenge mode, while Merriment is an easy to obtain red element. So it will be much easier to run with a maxed out Merriment than with Merciful Blessing. Surge is another DLC element. It has different types of effects depending on which character you play as. The Dynasty Warrior cast gets 10% damage to officers per 100 KOs, and it maxes out at 1500 KOs. The Samurai Warrior cast gets 10% damage to regular enemies per 100 KOs, and it also maxes out at 1500. And lastly, the Warriors Orochi cast gets 10% magic gauge regeneration rate and damage to monsters per 100 KOs. And it also again maxes out at 1500. Courage increases damage against officers. Nothing much else to say here. Just look out for not increasing your damage too much. At some point you can't even do combos anymore, because everything dies so fast. Brawn, Might, Destruction, Aggression and Divinity. I put them all into one group. The damage multiplier is decent, but nothing crazy for any of them. Here it really depends on your officer and their strong suits. Orochi and Orochi X, for example, have very strong normal attacks, so I'm using Brawn on them. Ryo's charge attack is one of the best in the game, which means I'm using Might on his builds. And I love Sun Quan's Musou attacks, that's why I'm using Destruction on him. Meteor and Reach are more technical elements, like Agility. Meteor shoots projectiles after launched enemies, dealing additional damage, and it sends them flying further. Reach increases your attack range, which can be very useful if you want to combine combo strings. If you time your switch combo right, you can even suck the enemies that got launched by Meteor back into your combo string. I have an honorable mention. The damage over time from Flame seems to be percentage based, which makes it a solid choice even in late game. Plus, it doesn't stun or freeze enemies, so your combo opportunities are much better with this one. Let's go over the different setups now. Osmosis and Absorption will be our base. Of course you could exchange Osmosis for Merriment. Also a must-have is either Wrath or Brilliance, but as I said, Wrath is definitely the superior choice here. Next up are your elemental choices. If you use 3 element and Windslay, you could have every available element on your weapon. There are just 2 problems with that. They are both gold elements, so they are much harder to farm and get to plus 20. And the second problem is that the game becomes incredibly easy and boring, since the enemies pretty much have no chance against you. They are constantly frozen or stunned, and the damage you deal is just ridiculous. What I recommend is early on going with Flame or Bolt and couple it with the Slay element, and later on you can exchange it to Flame Slay or Bolt Slay. I just think Ice is completely unbalanced and I really don't like to use it. It takes away a lot from the stylish combat and combo opportunities. The last must-have for me is Agility. The increased attack speed and combat flow feels just so much better to play with, so I can just never go without this element. You might ask yourself why I didn't choose Wind. That's because in this game the enemies are rarely guarding, so it's really not that important, like in other warrior titles. For the rest of your elements, it really depends on your officer now. So on Sun Quan, for example, I have his 5 base elements. Then I'm using Merriment because I want to spam his Musous, Destruction to increase the Musou damage, Reach so it's easier to combo string, and then just damage increases with Surge and Courage. A good alternative for Reach would be Divinity, because Unique Magic is also using Musou Gauge, so it's very easy to spam it as well. Here's a setup I would use on Jiazhong, for example. Again I went with the base stats, Osmosis, Absorption, Wrath and Agility, but with him I chose Bolt Slay and Flame Wind, so I can apply everything but Ice. He's using ranged throwing axes, so I think Reach is a must-have. Then I put on Meteor, since he launches enemies quite a lot. Echo has been severely nerfed from Warriors Orochi 3. It just now triggers occasionally and not every time. It can still be useful though on weapons with small hitboxes and low AoE capabilities. And lastly, Courage for the officer damage. An insane build on Yangqian is this setup. We again use the same base, Osmosis, Absorption, Agility and Wrath. Then we use the strongest elements, Windslay and Tree Element. We will be always on horse, so we want Steadfast, which means we can never be knocked off, Courage for the officer damage, and then we increase his charge attacks with Might and Rigor for maximum damage. Then you can just ride through the battlefield spamming your charge attacks and destroying everything. I hope I gave you some great build ideas and a better understanding of the elements. If you have any questions, ask me in the comments below, and don't forget to check out my other videos.